What the hell were you thinking, dropping predators on a conservation site? The words hit harder than the storm battering the research vessel's windows. Dr. Clara Yates didn't flinch. She stood with arms crossed, soaked to the bone, her boots still muddy from the island's northern slope. Across from her, the new wildlife supervisor, Mason Bell, slammed a damp file onto the table, one filled with photos, claw-marked trees, and the remains of something no one expected. This wasn't part of the plan, he snapped. You've made this island into a graveyard. Clara didn't respond. She just turned and stared through the rain-streaked glass toward the dim outline of St. Isaac's Island, once a seabird sanctuary, now a biological mystery. 8 years ago, they'd dropped nearly 1,000 feral cats onto that isolated patch of rock and forest in the middle of the North Pacific. No tourists, no permanent staff, just motion-triggered cameras, drone flyovers, and the promise of natural balance. Back then, it had made sense. The island was drowning in rats introduced decades earlier by merchant ship Sand. Those rats had obliterated the nesting populations of puffins, kittiwakes, and murres. Nothing worked. Poisons endangered the native foxes. Traps failed in the cliffs. So, one bold voice in the room had said it out loud. Let's let cats handle it. It became an experiment, a controversial, heavily debated, globally watched one. Feral cats were selected from shelters screened for hunting instincts, spayed or neutered to prevent breeding, and tagged with subdermal chips. They were flown in by helicopter and released in staggered groups. Scientists predicted an equilibrium within 5 years. What no one predicted was what happened next. The first year was what you'd expect. Rat numbers plummeted. Drone footage showed cats moving in small bands, hunting with ruthless efficiency. Seabird activity cautiously resumed. Egg counts slowly climbed. Clara had watched the footage with pride. The data was clean. The plan was working. But the following year, odd patterns emerged. The cats weren't just hunting, they were organizing. Camera traps caught clusters of them sharing kills, guarding specific ridges, even coordinating their movements. The term colony intelligence popped up in reports and was quickly dismissed as romanticizing the data. By year 4, foxes were gone. Even the invasive rats had all but disappeared. And yet, the cats thrived. New behavior was observed: strategic ambushes, soundless communication, even what one drone operator described as a funeral circle. When one of the cats was found dead near the coastline, 8 years in, the island looked like something out of a dream, lush, eerily silent, teeming with unseen eyes. What stunned the recent crew, however, wasn't the cat's survival. It was the discovery of fresh human bones, half-buried, gnawed. That's why Mason was yelling. That's why Clara's silence had become a scream in itself. Outside, the storm rolled over the ocean, but the real violence was waiting inland and mossy stones and rustling branches, where feline eyes didn't blink, and where the real question loomed larger than anyone dared admit. Had they created predators, or something far worse? The rain hadn't stopped for hours, and by the time the Zodiac touched down on St. Isaac's rocky beach, the air was thick with silence, and natural, almost staged. No gull cries, no rustling leaves, just the soft hiss of water on rock and the distant groan of the sea. Clara stepped out first, her boots sinking into wet sand littered with delicate feathers and claw-scored shells. Mason followed, rifle slung tight across his chest, his jaw clenched, eyes scanning the tree line like they were being watched, which they were. They made their way inland slowly, following a narrow trail carved long ago by researchers and since overtaken by moss and roots. Every few feet, Clara paused to examine signs. Prints in the mud, broken branches, something too precise to be random. They weren't just seeing movement, they were tracking something that had learned to stay invisible. For years, she had insisted this was a habitat and balance. But now, walking deeper into the woods, she felt that balance had tipped and not in their favor. A clearing opened up ahead, and in its center stood the remnants of the old supply shed, doors hanging, roof half collapsed, vines choking the outer frame. Mason moved toward it, flashlight beam slicing through the gloom. We found the bones right here, he muttered, behind that barrel. Clara crouched beside the rusted drum, heart tightening as she examined the disturbed soil. It was as if something had been buried, and then carefully unearthed. The scrape marks weren't chaotic. They were methodical, like fingers or claws. She brushed aside a layer of leaves and found more fragments, smaller sun-bleached pieces of what appeared to be a human hand, partially gnawed, still bearing the cracked curve of a fingernail. She stood too quickly and stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. That's not just scavenging, she whispered. Something dragged it out, something that knew where it was. Mason didn't respond. He was staring into the trees now, his shoulders rigid. Then he raised his hand slowly and pointed. Look, perched silently on a moss-covered boulder was a cat, black, scarred, and motionless. Behind it another, and then another. 5, 10, 15 pairs of eyes emerged like slow-burning embers from the forest shadows, all fixed on them, all unblinking. They didn't hiss, they didn't flee, they just watched. It was Clara who broke the moment. Need to go now. But as they turned back toward the path, they saw more cats silently blocking the trail, sitting in near-perfect formation. Mason's knuckles tightened on the rifle. They're surrounding us. Clara shook her head. No, hurting us. The realization landed like ice. These weren't the desperate, starving strays she'd studied a decade ago. These were coordinated, calculating. They didn't just adapt to the island, they had mastered it, and now they were controlling it, forced to take the longer route around the marshes. Clara and Mason kept moving until their legs ached and their clothes clung to their skin, but the cats followed, always at a distance, always in silence. It was as if the island itself had grown eyes, and those eyes didn't blink, didn't look away. When they finally reached the emergency weather station on the southern bluff, they bolted the door behind them and collapsed inside. Soaked, breathless, shaken, Clara didn't speak for a long time. She just stared at the weathered walls, at the photo pinned above the old Deska team photo from 8 years ago. Smiling researchers, fresh tents, fresh hope. 2 of those faces, Clara realized, had never left the island. The disappearance had been ruled an accident, a storm, perhaps a slip into the sea. But she knew now, those explanations had been too easy, and tomorrow morning she would finally say it out loud. Something went wrong on this island, and they had unleashed it by morning. The storm had eased, but the weight of the night lingered like fog clinging to the cliffs. Clara sat at the edge of the weather station's cat, her hands trembling as she sipped lukewarm coffee from a dented tin mug. Across from her, Mason stood by the window, scanning the tree line with haunted eyes. The silence outside hadn't lifted, it had deepened. Every rustle of wind, every creak of old wood now sounded like a whisper, like breath just out of you. Clara finally spoke. I think we lost control years ago, we just didn't want to see it. Mason didn't answer right away. You mean we didn't want to believe it? There's a difference. He turned, eyes narrowing. What happens if we're the next ones who don't leave this island? She didn't respond. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the weight of what she was beginning to understand left no room for words. This wasn't just an ecological collapse. It wasn't just feral cats surviving too well. It was evolution happening at a pace and in a direction no one had anticipated, and it had been set into motion by their own hands. They left the station that afternoon with a plan to retrieve the black box field data, left at the southern observation tower high bluff once used for drone launches and weather monitoring. If they could access the tower's archived footage, maybe they could find out what really happened to the last crew that vanished nearly 2 years ago. It was a risk, but a necessary one. The hike was brutal. The trail had narrowed, overgrown, and slick with moss, and several times Mason had to hack through brambles just to stay on course. The cats followed, not in a pack, not close, but they were there, always in peripheral vision, a tail disappearing into brush, a shape perched high on a limb, always watching. When they reached the tower, the wind had picked up again, rattling the loose metal sheets like bones in a drum. The stairs groaned under their weight as they climbed. Inside, the control panel flickered with faint reserve power, and Clara worked quickly, inserting her old access chip and pulling up the last synced recordings. The screen buzzed, glitched, then displayed time-stamped footage from April 3, 2023, the day the last research team had vanished. What they saw stopped them cold. The team, 4 biologists and a technician, had gathered near the northern ravine. They were marking GPS coordinates when a group of cats appeared in the tree line. At first, they ignored them, but then something changed. The cats didn't scatter like before. They advanced, slowly, deliberately. The team noticed. One of the men shouted and raised his arms. It didn't matter. From every direction the cats emerged, not in chaos, in formation. The footage cut out there, but the final frame before the static hit showed a dozen cats mid-air, claws extended, and the look on the technician's face, pure realization. Too late to stop it. Clara recoiled from the screen. They hunted them. No, Mason said, barely audible. They executed them. Suddenly, a sound below scraping metal. Clara's eyes snapped to the stairwell. Mason peered over the edge. Shadows moved. They're here. She turned to grab the drives. We can't let this footage die on this island. But something was already climbing, not scrambling. Climbing. Not a single meow, not a hiss, just silence and movement. The moment Clara and Mason realized the tower wasn't a refuge, it was a trap, they backed toward the window. The only way out was down the outer ladder, and the cats were already blocking the stairs. Mason went first. He gripped the outer ladder, slick with sea spray and rust, and began the slow descent down the tower's spine. Clara followed, her pulse pounding so hard she could feel it in her jaw. She kept the data drive zipped inside her jacket, one hand clenched around the iron rung, the other bracing the ladder's edge. Above them, a chorus of soft scratching echoed against the metal walls, claws on steel, fast and light. It was like listening to rain that chose its drops with intent. Halfway down, a cat leapt from a nearby beam, narrowly missing Mason's shoulder. As it slammed against the side of the ladder, tail lashing, eyes locked, it didn't attack again. It just stayed there, watching. More shapes appeared in the tower's framework, poised along girders and platforms, not chasing, herding. By the time they reached the forest floor, the air had thickened with dread. It wasn't fear of death. Clara had felt that before during storms. During rescue missions it was a deeper, quieter terror, the sense that something ancient had been disturbed, and now it watched them from behind every tree. They didn't speak as they ran. Mason led the way, cutting eastward toward the marsh where their emergency raft had been hidden. It was their only chance to leave the island undetected. As they crashed through undergrowth, Clara stumbled, her foot caught in a root butt. Mason hauled her back up before she hit the ground. "Keep moving," he snapped, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop, not even for a second." They arrived at the clearing, and for a moment Clara's breath caught. The raft was still there, folded and dry beneath a camouflaged top. But something was wrong. The top had been moved, not torn or ripped, lifted like by hands or paws. A single paw print sat in the center of the raft's frame, pressed into the dust, bigger than it should have been. Broader, and next to it a claw, not a scratch, a deliberate mark. They inflated the raft in silence, adrenaline pushing their hands faster than their thoughts. When they launched into the water, the wind picked up behind them, carrying the smell of moss, decay, and something faintly metallic. As the island shrank behind them, Clara turned to look back just once. Dozens of them stood on the shore, lined along the tree line like statues. Their eyes reflected the last light of dusk. No yowling, no growling, just stillness, calculated, triumphant. Hours later, soaked and shivering inside the coastal ranger station, Clara uploaded the footage and data into the secure research database. Mason collapsed into a chair, face drawn and pale. Neither of them spoke for a long time. It was an intern who found the footage first. Then came the calls, the warnings, the satellite scans. What they saw on the footage wasn't just organized behavior, it was strategy, a collective intelligence they had never expected. Something more than survival, something closer to planning. By the end of the week, federal authorities locked down the island. No flyovers, no press, and under no circumstances were the cats to be approached. Clara sat quietly in the back of the debrief room as her work was torn apart by analysts and agents. But no one asked her the question that kept her awake each night. What if this wasn't the first island? What if it had already happened somewhere else and no one lived to tell the story? And most haunting of all, what if these cats had never needed human help to begin with? What if releasing them was never the beginning? It was just the moment they let themselves be seen. 3 months after their escape, Clara stood alone before the panel at the Global Ecological Risk Summit in Geneva. Behind her, grainy surveillance footage flickered across the screen, cats moving like shadows, coordinating silently across the jungle floor of the island. The audience was still, not a cough, not a whisper, just breathless attention clinging to every frame. She didn't speak with drama or fear. She spoke with calm, deliberate clarity. This wasn't a failed conservation effort. It was a catastrophic misreading of nature's capacity to adapt when exposed to us. The room remained silent, even as the final slide appeared, a satellite. The photo of the island taken just 5 days prior. No human activity, no drones accepted. Yet there were new trails, cleared and carved with geometric precision, shaped like territory boundaries. None made by humans. Clara stepped down from the podium, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. Not because she felt safe, but because the truth had finally been said out loud. Mason met her near the exit, holding 2 coffee cups, dark circles still heavy beneath his eyes. "That went better than I expected," he muttered. "They think it's contained," she said. "Do you?" She didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, she handed him the envelope she'd been carrying since they left the island. Inside was a single photo taken by a deep-sea fishing crew off the coast of Sumatra. It had arrived anonymously, with no name, no explanation, just coordinates and a timestamp. On the shoreline of a different island, over 3,000 miles away, stood a small figure, a cat with 1 mangled ear and 3 dark stripes across its back. The exact same markings as the one they'd first seen on day 1 of their island mission. The same cat Mason had nicknamed Stripe without much thought. There was no way to prove it, but the timing matched. And so did the look in its eyes. It wasn't just an accident. These cats weren't multiplying in chaos. They were spreading, with intention. Islands, ports, unmarked shipping crates. A global lattice that no one had bothered to notice until it was too late. Back in the States, the footage was sealed under national security clauses. Clara and Mason were told to stop speaking publicly, though no one used the word threat. But something had changed. Birds were vanishing in record numbers along coastal towns. Entire populations of rodents gone without a trace. Forests, silent where they had once thrummed with life. In her journal, Clara wrote a final note before locking the pages away for good. "We thought we were gods, fixing balance where we had once broken it. But we were arrogant, blind, and now something is watching us from the trees, from the shadows, from just beyond the reach of light, and it does not forget." A decade later, people would speak of the island as a myth, a lesson, an eerie warning, never quite verified. But Mason, Clara, and a handful of silent observers would carry the truth inside them like a second heartbeat. Because sometimes, when you try to tame nature, it doesn't just fight back, it waits, it learns, and then it hunts.